Hey, everybody. I'm just going to be letting people in here for a few minutes. I don't think Jordan's on vacation today, so he won't be joining. Which actually raises a challenge about taking notes because he takes incredible notes.
Yes, he does.
Sorry to have to interrupt with your haircut plans today, man.
Oh, it's totally fine. My hairdresser was more than happy to reschedule, so it was no big deal.
You're in Somersworth, right? You're
Yes.
Yep. Somersworth. Any word yet on what the plans are for reopening?
Tuesday, they're gonna hopefully decide. My husband's actually on the school board, so
okay. You have an inside story.
And yeah, exactly. And they had
lobbying him one way or the other.
trying to be good. Let him decide. But certainly we talk about it nonstop. But no, it does seem tentatively that it will be fully remote with kind of plans to go back, or at least reassess throughout the year to determine if it's safe to go back at some point.
Yeah.
Right now, the challenges with social distancing and smaller groups and all that are just too much for us, too much of a hurdle for us to be able to get over and be able to do school safely. So
yeah.
Wait.
Jan.
Matt, that's in Somersworth, right?
Yes, yeah.
So elementary school or?
I teach middle school, so 7th grade for me, but I think the decision is going to be made for the whole district. So, but again, Tuesday is the official day we'll actually know, I think.
So I heard are you going to be you think distance learning from the get-go?
Yeah, that's what it seems like right now. So yeah. I've been working this summer with my colleagues in the building, or not in the building, but remotely, I should say, my colleagues at the middle school, to come up with a bunch of contingency plans. So we've pretty much drafted 3 different plans that we presented and gave to our administrators, and they sent up the chain to the school board. But yeah, from just speaking with my husband and hearing, watching the school board meetings, it does seem like the majority of them are leaning towards fully remote. So at least to start.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I one of the hybrid models that I'd heard in the last week is don't go back to school in class for the first month or 2. Mm-hmm. And watch what happens to everybody else.
Yeah. I think that may be part of some of their decision making, honestly, is like, let's just see what other schools do.
Yeah.
But
see how it goes. Give them
right.
Well, my
granddaughter, October 1st date.
My granddaughter's in Barrington, which is almost adjacent to Somersworth.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying, kids are coming back.
Wow.
Kids will, I think there'll be the option of staying home and being remote, but they're opening the doors. And
yeah, wow.
And the kids come back. Who knows how long any of these decisions will last.
Right, true.
I thought the Manchester superintendent the other day, Goldhart, I thought he laid out a scenario that sounded very complicated.
Yeah.
I can't say I heard what their decision was.
It's a blend from the get-go, and trying to move students in and out in bubbles or cohorts. Yeah. I don't know what the final. At any rate, he laid out that framework, and the details again would follow. But that sounded complicated.
Yeah.
No, I think it's maybe the most challenging situation that's being faced in the state. I mean, they have they have almost as many homeless students as Hopkinton has enrolled students.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, I'm going to be, Jordan's not with us today, so I'm managing some tech as well as trying to attend to the screen here. Somebody just sent me, I can't tell the number, it's a phone number. That the link that they're using to get into this isn't working for them right now. But I'm going to resend it out to everybody. Try to capture that person.
We've got two participants, two attendees so far who have made it through.
Yeah. But this is a commission member that's sent this to me, so I will simply resend to everybody. That's not the link, actually. Right. All right, let me find the link and send that to everybody. Jordan is usually the guy that handles this stuff for me.
All right, we're going to cut a lot of slack today.
Let's see, copy hyperlink. I can do that. Or actually, maybe I can just send this out to everybody again.
The calendar invite, I just tried and it worked. So opening that up and clicking worked.
Yeah, let me just.
Okay.
In the meantime, anybody in the waiting room who's a panelist, I'll be promoting you in just a minute. As soon as I do this. Okay, all right, that's out. Okay, back to Zoom. Something about. All right, looks like we don't have any panelists waiting to be promoted.
Oh, we're.
Let's see, we just got a note from Jane. Jane, I can't remember if she sent it to you.
Yes, I got it.
Jane has all of a sudden has a conflict. Unable to join. Here comes Mary Heath. Let's see, I don't see Val yet.
Barbara?
There's Iris.
Thanks, finally. I don't know what happened to that link.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, let's get going. We'll just do the formalities of introducing ourselves and where we are. Jay Kahn in Keene in a room by myself. And just, let's see, Bill, you're there?
Yes, hi, in Concord with a lawnmower group outside, so wearing headphones, thanks.
All right, look good on you. Iris?
Hi, yes, home in Barrington, husband downstairs.
Thank you. And other committee members, I don't see Barbara Tremblay. There's Val. Give him a second. Val, just tell us where you are.
In my office in Jaffrey, by myself.
All right, thank you. All right, other members of the commission, Dave?
Dave Luneau here in Hopkinton with Ozzy, the long-haired dogs.
Yeah, thank you. Dick?
Hey, Dick Ames. I'm here in Jaffrey. I'm alone. Thank you.
Rick Ladd?
Rick Ladd's here in Haverhill, New Hampshire, and alone.
Mary Heath? Oh, silence. And Mel?
Mel Myler, Port Clyde, Maine, and alone.
And Mary?
I'm here. Mary Heath in Manchester, home alone.
Okay. Other Carsey Institute staff here with us. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, yeah, Matt Girding here in Somersworth by myself.
Great. And Drew, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Drew Atchison at AIR in Washington, D.C., in the room by myself at the moment.
All right. Bruce, you're...
I'm here, Bruce Mallory, Kittery Point, in my office alone. And just a couple, if I can make a couple of logistical comments quickly. Matt, I hate to do this to you on the spot now that you've arranged for afternoon to join us, but in the absence of Jordan, could you please take minutes that do not have to be verbatim? We call them notes actually from these work group meetings. But if you can catch the gist of the comments, just a running gist of the comments, I would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't mind.
At the same time. And the second logistical comment is that typically we turn off the chat function for these work group meetings and ask our attendees who are listening in to use the Q&A function. I don't know how to do that. If somebody else does, I can promote you to host and you can turn off the chat. But in the meantime, we'll just say that the primary means for communicating by attendees to the work group, we won't be responding or answering questions, but that's where we keep a record of comments made as the public listens into these meetings. So please use the Q&A function if you would like to do that.
Thank you, Bruce.
Back to you, Jay.
Thank you. All right, let's see. The agenda for today, hopefully we all have that before us, as I say that. We are, Matt Girding has prepared, we're going to, let me just lay out the agenda. We're going to start with the adequacy, pick up on that definition conversation that we had at the last meeting. We've got at least 3 segments to that conversation, and hopefully we'll get through that in our first hour. One segment is where Matt has done a good job of summarizing of the 14 chapters of education statutes in the state, where some of those changes have occurred that are part of what local school districts are mandated to respond to, incorporate into their rules and into the services that they provide. A second piece is to then return to the adequacy and cost discussion paper that Bruce distributed prior to our last meeting. It's unedited, but it still is a guide to the discussion today. So we'll take a look at that and any follow-up thoughts that people have. And then among others of those thoughts that will want to surface in that conversation, Rick Ladd's put something together that begins to tweak some of the 193E2 statutory language as well as E3. So we'll take a look at that. And Bill, relative to your, will we see, take a look at actual statutes in front of us, whether you pull up the RSA or you wait for Bruce to put Rick's comments up there. We'll have what is and what might follow for suggestions. So we'll try to see if we can arrive at a discussion piece for our July 27th meeting. That's the goal. Can we do that? The second part to the conversation is to talk about cost, review that section of the discussion paper, and to draw Drew Atchison into the conversation to talk about the methodology being used by AIR to determine outcomes to cost factors, both in terms of the capacity of districts to generate revenue, but also the amounts that they spend. So we'll want Drew to help us envision what does that regression line look like. And also, Drew, if you can help us understand, will we be able to identify the school district outliers who are having great success or better than expected success given the capacity and the spending that they do? Because that may give us a methodology for drilling down on some of those more successful models. So with that, I see Barbara Tremblay has joined us, I think, from Keene. Barbara, you want to just introduce?
I had trouble getting in today. Sorry. Barbara Tremblay, I'm in Keene, husband in the other room.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. And Jen Four is with us as well. Thank you, Jen, for joining us. All right.
Jay, Iris has her hand up. She has a question.
Iris.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted, Bruce knows that I have an issue with something that was laid out as a sort of a recollection of the presentation by Ann Edwards as it was presented to the group. And I wanted to clarify what I thought I heard versus what was presented in the email. And I didn't know where that fit in the agenda, given if we're going to start with a look at all those statutes, it might fit right in there.
You want to lead off with that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Bruce just capsulized the presentation as saying that the state was obligated, that Ann Edwards stated that the state was obligated to pay for everything that was outlined in statute and rules. That's not what I took her to say. I took her to say that the state is obligated to pay for whatever the legislature defines and costs as an adequate education. And there's quite a difference. So I just wanted, as we begin that conversation, to lay that basic premise out on the table and see if we agree or disagree with whatever interpretation.
And I'll just say that my language was not careful, and in Dave Luno's wording, I might have been precise, but I wasn't accurate. So Iris's clarification is appreciated.
I see Dick's hand up.
Yeah, I guess I generally agree, but I think the language that Iris just used is too wide open for whatever the legislature chooses to define as adequacy is too broad. And I think it has to be a credible reflection of what the legislature takes from the statutes as sufficient to pay for an adequate education. So you got the statutory language, you've got a judgment that the legislature makes with respect to that, but it's got to be a good judgment because it's going to be second guessed if it's a bad judgment.
I agree.
And I think she also distinguished it from targeted aid.
Yes.
Adequacy as opposed to targeted, right?
Agreed.
Well, if I could, Jay, just supporting Iris's summary with Dick's qualification, I think the point is that Ann's summary, Attorney Edwards' summary, seemed to reflect the position that if the legislature defines adequacy and determines a cost for adequacy, however determined, but it has to be credible, that the state budget, and this is where I'm looking to Iris to just make sure, maybe through an example, the state budget funded with state taxes has to pay all 100% of that cost wherever it is identified. So Dave, I don't think that she really said anything particularly unique about targeted aid. It may be that the determination of adequacy by the legislature might have some differential built into it.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And then, but I think Iris's point, and she directly joined the issue that I've been raising and been concerned about, is the exact issue that I think stands most importantly before this work group and the commission is, you know, does the court rule say that the state must, you know, distribute funds to Hanover and Claremont and not focus funds first on Claremont? You know, that's the real issue. And I think Iris has stated, I believe, Ann's statement pretty well, unless anyone, something I've said has screwed it up. But
Well,
I want to say,
You know, Attorney Edwards did actually specifically refer to targeted as opposed to as different from adequacy. But what I took her comments, and I think it's consistent with what everybody's saying, that if school district A had if the cost of an adequate education as defined by the legislature in school district A is $5,000, and the cost of an adequate education in school district B as defined in the legislature is $10,000, then the state's responsible for paying $5,000 to district A and $10,000 to district B. They can't pay district A $1,000 and district B $10,000.
Right.
Right.
I do think that she left, and I think following exactly what you said, that the cost can be different in different districts. I think she did leave open the possibility, just as we've been doing with weights. Weighting is targeting within adequacy.
Correct. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I wrote down, I took this quote as well. She was quoting the Londonderry decision and said that the same amount of adequacy for all schools, the community needs capacity for opportunity. And she defined the capacity for opportunity as equaling base cost for adequacy plus targeted amount of aid.
Right, weighting. And I think, you know, we had that presentation with the maps and where things were concentrated. I think that if we look back to the issue of concentrations, we'll be able to figure out ways to target within adequacy.
Yeah, I think part of our wrestling with this concept is that many of us who've worked with this terminology of adequate really find it challenging and almost offensive. And I think that's the challenge of trying to communicate something other than what's been done in the past. We certainly are. I mean, nobody wants to just say, let's give them something adequate. You know, I suppose 800 calories a day might be adequate, but it doesn't necessarily lead to an education.
I agree with you, Jay, and I wonder, I myself keep getting hung up on that word, as I stated last week when we talked about our thoughts, is when we look at adequate, is that holding us up and not thinking bigger, different, better? I know for me, I have to keep, adequacy means this, 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 this. Maybe we ought to just throw out the word adequacy and say, what do we want? What is best? What can we do? What might that look like? I really have to talk to myself to keep doing that so that we won't do just an adequate education. We might do something better. And then, of course, you know, how we pay for that will also be very different, I would imagine, as we go forward. I think we're all thinking of various possibilities, whether it's targeted this, plus this. I think we're all trying to come up with different scenarios that might better meet not only now, but in the near future. I think whatever we propose has got to be dynamic. Who would have thought we would have COVID-19? And that certainly has thrown a number of things in here. So whatever we do, the new word is nimble. It's got to be nimble, flexible, so that dynamic. We don't wait 20 years. We have the opportunity to change as need be. I'll be quiet.
Oh, that's not expected.
So Jay,
Yes.
I've always, you know, during this process, I've sort of taken the word adequate as being a term of art, as opposed to the Webster's definition of adequate. You know, prior to sort of getting into this, I was, you know, always applying the Webster's definition of adequate, but I thought I ran across something in one of the AIR things, or maybe something on another state's website, that adequate's really a legal term of art in education funding.
I agree with that, if I may. Just to jump in, it is a term of art. It's a very rich term that's been massaged over the years, and I think it's best that we sort of move on to its essence and work through it rather than get sidetracked on what a better term might be.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we. It certainly is education. You know, why we've got to qualify it, and I think that, you know, this is an opportunity, and I go back, Bill. We've had this conversation that maybe the courts just don't have all of the answers, because they occasionally look at education, and I think some pushback on on that notion. We can develop a cost of what it is to educate a child. We can put dollar ranges on what it costs to educate a child. We can say minimum amount required to educate a child, without getting ourselves caught up in this single term that nobody's going to agree with.
Jay, on that, I wanted to just say, I think that it's important, and Dave and Dick have said this. What the court, I think, said is that the legislature in the first instance must define what it thinks this adequacy standard is. It is a standard, and what the reason, and I copied some of this language from the accountability decision. The purpose for this standard is for judicial review. If in the future a family in Claremont were to feel that its children were not being provided with an adequate education, it needs to file a suit to get a remedy. And the court has said clearly that it wants the legislature to define the standard against which the education that's being delivered will be evaluated and judged. And so to some extent, what it needs is, it's like you say, you know, the standard for speeding is 55 miles an hour. And the legislature sets that. And then the test is, did the particular case go faster or slower than that standard? And to some extent, I think that's what the adequacy definition is about from the court's view. You're right, from the average person in the public, you know, who doesn't deal with these judicial standard issues on a daily basis, it kind of says, the Webster definition, Dave Luno, might be the governing thing, but I don't think that's what the court meant. I think that's why it's important to use that terminology and not try and change it. But in communicating what we're doing, we can be clearer so that the public understands what the legislature is supposed to do.
Jay, if I could interject just a process here, because we're actually going to engage this pretty deeply when we get to Rick's thoughts on the agenda, on the revised agenda. I know that Iris had raised her hand a few minutes ago to make a comment, but we might want to go ahead and take a look at
an agenda
at Matt's inventory, and then come back to the definitional issues, and then get to the cost issues of it.
Yeah. I'm trying to bite my tongue on saying something more, which I will.
This is a great discussion. This is exactly the discussion we should have. I just want to lose track of the other things we want to be sure.
And just, it is important, Bruce, to have an open discussion that is interactive and not always kind of hamstrung by a particular agenda flow. Sometimes we have to do some of that, but I think that let's follow that instruction. I don't think it's a bad thing.
I've had my for a while. I just want to say something brief, which is I don't think anybody who really values public education can really stomach adequacy as a term without getting nauseous. But I've tried to accept it as what I see as the state's minimum obligation. And if you, as Bill was saying, it's a standard, it's a legal standard, and didn't back getting rid of the standard. But yeah, it's a minimum standard. And if you look at it that way, it's a little easier to take.
What surprises me in it is that it's gotten separated from the constitutional responsibility of an opportunity. And how that's got separated is puzzling for me. And when I asked Anne about that, she said, oh, I didn't mean to say a constitutionally adequate education. I meant to say the opportunity for a constitutionally adequate education. It is that opportunity that I think is the challenge of the state, is to create that opportunity. And that opportunity can't be defined as just a couple of curriculum standards and the limited purpose statement that there is. That's my challenge in working with this. All right, Matt, and with that might have set you up. Give us some insight as to your journey to through the statutes to the
sure
that you gave us.
Let's see. I wonder if I can share my screen to show you the document.
Made you co-host, Matt, so if you can.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Let me just.
And other people received this sometime yesterday, not terribly long in advance. But.
Yeah. Oh, hold on. Quick tech thing. I have to change settings. One sec.
We got it early enough to be overwhelmed by it.
It is overwhelming. There's a lot in there. All right, let's see if this works now. Okay,
yeah,
you can see my screen?
One sheet.
Say that again?
I couldn't get just one sheet to print out, or whatever you would call it.
Right,
one
yeah.
tab.
I broke it down into a variety of sheets just due to some of the breadth of what I was hoping to capture. But so yeah, I made that first sheet is just the table of contents. This kind of gives you an idea of what the other preceding sheets are going to look like. The first one, and you guys can see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the first part here is the kind of just historical perspective. In terms of legal cases, I started with the Claremont cases. And then in terms of like the actual bills that are being proposed, I went as far back as 1999. I tried to give us, about 20 years to look at. And I mean, I should preface all this with, this is still a work in progress. There's a lot in here, but there are potential oversights that still could be added. I know a few still need to be added this week that I was alerted of. But so if you do see anything, please let me know. But again, back to the perspective here, I wanted to capture just how the state has moved forward with things since the Claremont cases. Again, there's a lot in here. There's a lot that has been proposed or had been proposed, a lot that had been taken out. Certainly a lot of these earlier bills that were passed have since been changed, which is why I've added the actual RSA sheet later on. But ultimately, this kind of just serves as almost your history lesson leading into the other sheets. So I won't spend too much on this unless you guys would like me to. And then, so the second part, this is where we actually get into the RSAs that are published within the most recent edition of the New Hampshire Education Law. So that is a pamphlet passed out, I believe, by the DOE to all of the districts across the state, as well as administrators, and it outlines the most recent laws pertaining particularly to education. Now, certainly there's a ton in there that are just barely tangentially related, which I thought was funny. So I tried to filter out things specific to our concerns. And so I created this master list, which is this tab 2, but then even put these RSAs through a finer filter to create 2A, 2B, and 2C. And so I'll talk about those. So again, this is kind of your giant list. Before moving on to the A's, B's, and C's, just note that it is broken down by chapter RSA, and then I wrote a brief description. So the first thing I thought was worth noting, or first RSAs that were worth noting, were those pertaining to funding. And so again, through filtering all these, I found a variety of RSAs. You know, there's some particular to the counties, some that deal with taxation, and then a lot that deal within the actual education chapter of the RSA. And so this includes, you know, everything from special education funding to career tech, as well as some of the specific adequacy and school money RSAs that we probably will need to discuss moving forward. From here,
let me just add,
yeah, go ahead.
That one of the things that could easily point out, particularly in this COVID moment, is that, and I know, Matt, you're still adding to it, but chapter 200 requires the nurse and requires the emotional, social, behavioral disorder, MTSSB kinds of things that school specific need to address. So I mention it because those are some new cost factors that, particularly in light of the COVID, you know, 175 of 177 school districts now have a nurse. And maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we didn't do that.
Yeah, definitely worth noting. And it is also worth noting that the most recently updated version of New Hampshire education law is the 2018-2019. So with some of the laws that were passed over this past session, those were not added in. I have tried to do my due diligence and cross-reference things that have been most recently passed and make sure that they're in here. Again, there may be some that have been missed. So please definitely let me know.
That's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then so 2B, this is more pertaining to finance, and certainly you could make an argument that finance and funding are one and the same, but I felt like it was worth separating these things because I felt like finance was a category specific to almost like what regulations are there around how municipalities or how school districts govern the money within them. So not necessarily like regulations pertaining to how much they need to spend or what they need to spend things on, but more like if you look at like this chapter 31, powers and duties, you could see like the very first one is that they may purchase and hold real and personal estate, or, you know, pretty much saying like, oh, they can have property. So it's something certainly not particular to them funding their schools, but it is saying that they are able to have access to owning property like a school building or materials or things like that. And so this is, I think, a little bit larger list only because some of these are just really minute specific RSAs, if that makes sense.
Matt, I
Yep.
think that your summary is very good. And the point you just made is worth emphasizing, that without action by the state legislature to pass laws that delegate powers to own property, powers to govern property, powers to administer schools, powers and requirements, without that, the towns and cities don't have that power. So
Absolutely.
you're in one way you can look at this 2A, 2B, 2C to be trying to categorize and and collect all of those areas. And as Jay points out, there's many detailed areas. It's very complex. But the very big point is this is the delegation of authority and power from state government, from many legislatures to local government units, school districts, towns, and cities. And so in creation of, even a town or a city is a legislative act, and then school districts certainly. So I think it's very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a good segue into 2C, which is more pertaining to just the actual policies or responsibilities that are placed upon municipalities and school districts. And so again, more kind of regulatory type RSAs. And in here, I'm trying to remember, there was one. Yeah, again, also including duties of the Department of Education as well. So kind of how they govern and what they're specifically responsible for. And so again, this is a pretty large one as well. But if there are finer filters you'd like me to put through these, I would be more than happy to, and make a 2D or E or however many you would like. Feel free to let me know. It doesn't have to necessarily be today. Feel free to email me, but I can definitely filter these even more if you would like. And so then tab 3, this is just specific appropriations just for the educational trust fund within the budgets that were passed. And so you please note that it is outlined specifically by the House bills, and obviously we know some HB ones aren't always the ones that get passed. So there's the preceding ones that actually did make it through, like HB 144, so on and so forth. But it breaks it down by the taxes outlined within the appropriations or the revenue streams within the appropriations. Certainly not everything in the educational trust fund is necessarily a tax, but it shows you the dollar amounts that are outlined within the budget themselves. Interesting. I still have not been able to access the 2004-2005 budget. The document is actually inaccessible through the website. So if anyone happens to know how to access that, that would be great. I think the link in the DOE, I think, oh no, where did I find it? One of the agencies, the link that I was trying to access doesn't exist anymore. So I know it exists. I might have to email someone to find it, but if anyone happens to know how to access that, I would be extremely helpful.
We can probably ask, I think Jen's, yeah, she's online with us.
Okay.
She might be able to find that.
That'd be great.
Jen, is that?
Oops, say that again.
I could contact LBA. I'm not sure if you use their documents, but they build the budget, the Legislative Budget Assistance Office. And I believe they maintain a lot of historical documents online.
Perfect. Yeah, that would be great. Or even if you just have a contact you could forward me, and I don't mind reaching out to them either.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Matt, it'd be an interesting thing to add a column just for your check that added column C through everything but the total. And I say that because they may not equal the total education fund.
Sure.
And the point to that is that we've drawn on the education trust fund as a reserve in the past, not raising all of the dollars on an annual basis, but letting the difference accumulate within the trust fund. The other
Yeah.
thing that I find valuable is to, while we all know that the statewide property tax is a fixed dollar amount, it is a guide. I set this up as a possible discussion under cost. It is a guide that the legislature has set a precedent for setting a baseline of funding. And I know that that's been kind of a point that that Iris has said. We've got to establish a floor to what the legislature and the state appropriates. I just thought I'd throw that out there. There's precedent to do that through statute.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why you see the column here pretty much being the same.
Just to
number
comment
throughout.
on what Jay just said, I think the first point is a good one. And the CAFR, the annual comprehensive, whatever it's called, the financial document that's put out by DAS, does wrap things together so that it shows what extra either poured into the education fund at the end of the year, the trust fund, or was left in it for use in the next year.
I actually do have a tab specific to that as well, so I can show you all that as
okay.
Let's see, I think it might be 4. Yeah, so this is the actual revenue and appropriations outline for the past 10 years. So this, I believe, is from that you were mentioning. And so, yeah, broke it again down by same categories that we saw in the previous one. So just kind of show differences specifically between the budget and then what actually was raised and what actually was appropriated. And so, again, as you both had mentioned, it's certainly useful to look at.
Matt, to Dick Ames' point, what's awesome about the CAFR is it supplies this data in the surplus statement format, which is, it's got that is really the thing that balances out. And the CAFR is probably the best resource because it's what the credit markets count on to make decisions about whether New Hampshire is creditworthy.
Perfect. I will look for that. The surplus statements you said?
Absolutely. And LBA is the right folks to chat with about that.
Okay, great.
You probably can access it on the on their website.
Okay, great. I will write that down.
LBA, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Legislative Budget Assistant.
But you can, yep.
Perfect. All right, so 5, this then 5 and 6 are 5 is the Department of Education, while 6 is the Department of Revenue Administration. But these are their actual budgets line by line, and for 2018, 2019. Certainly these are huge and expansive, but I do want to make note that I did highlight in yellow anytime it was outlined that they were utilizing Education Trust Fund. But it is interesting to see, I mean, certainly, you know, I'm in city government, but it's interesting to see what they have budgeted out. And I mean, this thing is thousands of lines long, so we don't have to go through that either.
100 pages.
Right, exactly. And then same with the DRA. And the reason, again, that I chose these two and haven't added in any other departments is because these are the only 2 departments that specifically have line items that are educational trust fund, as you see there. So welcome to do other departments as well if you find it necessary, but as far as I know, none of them.
And that amount is the tax abatement for low-income families.
And then,
municipal.
And then 7 is just citations if you want to see what I used to collect some of this, and hopefully this is useful.
Well, thank you, Matt.
You're very welcome.
Well, Matt, I'll say thanks also. I want to be sure folks are aware that Matt is working with us to partially to fulfill his final requirements for the Master's in Public Policy at UNH. And so he found himself as a, quote, intern, unquote, with the Carsey School this summer. And this is what we threw at him. And the fact that Matt is both a middle school teacher in Somersworth and a member of the city council in Somersworth means that at least he was interested in content and was willing to do this kind of, for us, to be clear, this is pro bono work that hopefully benefits Matt as much as it benefits us. Huge piece of work here.
Yeah. Well, this sorting is really unique and very valuable for us to be able to call on. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very, very welcome. Again, I, for my master's, have been interested in this education funding debate for a while. So I was very, very pleased to be able to work on this for you all. So draw on me for resources, for anything else if you need.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So we then have our adequacy definition. The beginning of the discussion paper that was distributed. And I was wondering if anybody had any further comments about this. If one was to move from what Matt just did with all of the details and move to something that summarized some of the costly items that a school district needs to absorb from those statutes. That's what drove this discussion on an adequate education, right, Bruce?
Yeah. Yes.
So some of these things that we've listed as optional services with the direction that there is in statute, it's clear that some of these are no longer that optional, right? They're base costs. And I look at
right.
The nurses and psychologists and testing requirements. These aren't optional expenses, given that every school district has access to these either by contract or employment. Professional services. Val's got his hand up.
Yeah, just curious. I mean, the definition is somewhat dated, and the legislature has, made adjustments over time with new rulings and whatever that aren't reflected in the adequacy definition or formulas that we've seen in the past. Like, for example, work-based learning is becoming a much more important aspect of what is considered adequate, at least by the economic considerations of what value an education has, but it's not in the definition. But the legislature has added legislation that defines the state's role in helping to provide for that. So do we go back and add to adequacy the things that have been added, or do they just hang out there for funding resources only provided perhaps by the locality and not by the state?
I think that's a great observation. It's hard to not add things or to recognize at least what are given required expenses of districts. And Bill.
This relates back to the issue that Iris addressed at the beginning of the call. For me, we're running into a fundamental disconnect policy-wise. As I listen to you, Jay, talk about the conundrum of adequacy, the statutes require many things that go into a comprehensive education, in fact, CTE and things like that. But at the same time, the fundamental policy choice and engine of New Hampshire's current system of public education is a delegation to local government units, local school districts, to do a lot of things. and a delegation of taxing power locally to fund what the local towns and city democratic processes think are important. If what we do is when we define and cost adequacy is we automatically produce a situation where you're not using local taxing power as part of the finance mechanism, we're fundamentally changing the nature of how we have set up our primarily locally governed public school system. And I just wanted to say that I feel this tension, and you know, I felt it from the beginning. And with the people on this call, Jay, you, Dave Luno, Dick, Iris, who was in the middle of this, Mel, who's been doing it, and Drew, I want to know, how do we reconcile this problem? Because otherwise, every time we say, wow, this is important to an adequate education, there'll be some guy on the other shoulder of ours saying, oh boy, can this be added to the state budget? I think I just want to know, how do we find our way through that path? And sorry for the open-ended question, but it's killing me on how to move ahead.
Well, I think that's a good framing of of the difficulty of trying to, you know, and I think it's the literal versus the conceptual. How do you not recognize what literally we have delegated? And how do you not recognize that the local contribution is part of what the Constitution says is part of the opportunity?
So Jay, you know, if I could share a couple thoughts on this.
Can I say that Iris has had her hand up for a bit?
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry. No.
I have narrowed my screen. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi. I don't know whether the conversation as you started, it was working off of the discussion paper and the section definition of adequacy.
Yes.
Versus the actual statute definition that's in effect, which is what Bill sent us. I think that under definition of adequacy here, you're starting to muddle again the definition and the costs. The issue is not whether you have textbooks or nurses. The issue is what are those functions or those you said conceptual versus literal. I see the definition is more conceptual. What are the elements, not what are the deliverables to get there. That's where they come in.
I like that. I like that observation.
So I think we're getting, I don't like the way this list is. I'd rather us stick to the actual definition and discuss whether we want to make changes.
Well, it's nice that you set that one up. In fact, Rick, and maybe we can put up what Rick's, Rick tried to, Rick, why don't you describe what you tried to do?
Okay, can you hear me, everybody?
Yep.
Last night I was just watching television. I said, this is a waste of my time. So I decided, well, I'll go look at 193 and try to start describing and defining adequacy. So I went to the statute, and 193E, and it's up there in front of you right now. And I think Bill Ardinger referenced part of the policy and purpose statement there before. And I really have no problem with that. In looking at the Constitution, I only see one word that's really relevant to this whole discussion, that we're providing opportunity for education. These descriptors that we use, if you were to talk to Anthony in legislative services, he said every time you put an adjective in front of something, you're going to have to define that adjective, whether it's adequate or whether it's quality. So what I was trying to do last night, and you can see in the first on line 12 or 13 there, where I say it's not to provide an adequate education, is to provide the opportunity for a quality education. That's stolen directly from the state of Vermont. Quality education is different than what I've always, during the years that I've been on the education committee, I've always interpreted and had interpreted to me the word adequate in so many different ways. Sometimes, as I think Iris mentioned earlier in this, minimum standards. Or some people say it's a minimal amount, or it's a marginal amount, or it's just adequate or acceptable. It doesn't talk about the whole child and preparing the child for life. It speaks to perhaps what we're trying to get out of some test score. And if we're looking at the opportunity for an education, we're talking about the whole child, social, emotional, physical well-being of the child. And it involves so many more services and programs than we have expressed or see in statute right now. If you move down lower into 193E2, I made a few changes here, and these are just basically where I'm adding complex engineering challenges into a statement there in the bottom and going through. I added music in, but then after doing this, when I got to 193E2A, I'm starting to say, well, I'm getting trapped in that same problem we're in. We're trying to make this laundry list of what we provide, and it's a very confusing thing. If you were to look at 189:49 right now, and that is a program which 189:49, let me look that up right now. It deals directly with optional services. And you see optional services as everything we do in schools, nurses service, food services, it's all optional there. But if you go elsewhere, for example, 189:16, textbooks and supplies we've built into our adequacy formula. But it says in statute, that's not a responsibility of the state. That's a responsibility at the expense of the city or town. So we have conflicting language all through our statutes. This needs to be cleaned. And so I went and looked at this definition, which I incorporate everything in red, I put into this statute and deleted, you can see the sections, but it identifies a substantive education. The criteria for this in the past has been English language arts, reading, mathematics, science, social studies, arts, education, etc. It just goes down the list of subjects. I liked Vermont's definition where they put instruction and curriculum. And then I put down criteria identified in 193E2 because there's some neat things that are in those statements we looked at the beginning. And then other flexible pathways for learning progressions. That could be CTE, that could be internships, that could be concurrent dual enrollment. It could be all that, alternative forms of education. Personalized learning, we're talking about the student. School leadership, there's places in statute where we're required to have a superintendent on board in a district, but we don't fund it. And so you're going to have leadership within a school and staffing. And then staff professional development and evaluation, multi-tiered systems of support, which can include special education services, Title I services, remedial services, on the list goes, but it's not so specific. And so that's what I'm trying to drive home, is that I'm trying to get away from this laundry list and build in the whole child. So we're talking about what services are needed. Well, you need a schoolhouse, you need school facilities, you need a learning environment that we're experiencing right now with HVAC systems or sound and lighting in schools, which are probably detrimental to kids being there right now. And certainly in the winter months, if you have bad lighting and you see a shadow on your paper every time you put your hand on top of your paper, that's not good for young kids. And certainly we say that we need student transportation services, K through 8. And if the commissioner says you will provide it for a high school kid, that's there as well. However, in adequacy, we're funding transportation for every child in school right now. It's a component of the base adequacy, yet we're not required. So there's conflict throughout. I also, in part 2 here of this, put down the standard shall cover pre-K, stripped out kindergarten through 12th grade. I feel after we heard from Duke Albany's this morning that this is even more reinforced for me, seeing that this is what business and retailers and our jobs programs out there are asking, that we have these programs. We need to have support from these people. And I think we can get pre-K if we do it wisely, but it's not going to happen today or tomorrow possibly. It's going to be one of those transition things we're going to have to walk into and find the costing for that program. So I've tried to get away from a specific laundry list and defining what is this criteria for an adequate education, and putting a wider breadth of materials in there so that we're private. And one of the things I said, a quality education that ensures that all students in New Hampshire public schools shall be afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal in quality and meet or exceed the specific criteria. And that would be down below. And of course, then somebody's going to ask, well, what is your definition, Rick, of instruction and curriculum? It's different in every school because schools, this is a local control issue. It's not decided by us. We took the frameworks for various subjects out of where we are right now. They used to be guidelines. That doesn't exist. It's out of statute. So this is what I tried to tackle last night, seeing that we're going to have to figure out how we're going to word this somewhere along the way when legislation does occur. And this is just starters trying to get people to think a little bit. I probably have left something off here. I don't see food services on there, for example. That's part of what we should be doing and providing a hot lunch program for breakfast. Now we're providing even more than that for kids that need it. I spoke with Jay earlier today, and I had a young man that was in my school up in Homer, Alaska. He lived with his mother and the dog in the car they lived in. That was it. He came to school smelling, unkept, but he had an IQ of 140. He was in our gifted program. The school nurse gave him a shower every morning, washed his clothes, and he was able to get in the classroom. He became more accepted by the kids, by the community at large, and was able to go on, become a productive student, and gave to the school and they gave back to his community. That was only because of the school and our willingness to understand that the environment and the condition he came from was beyond his control. So it's educating the whole child. I'm not an advocate of trying to say that we got to drop this laundry list. I'd like to keep it broad. I keep it more general like Vermont did. And quality is important. But again, I kind of agree with Jay also that anytime you put any adjective in front of the word education, you're going to have to define that. And you're never going to have the right answer for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. And you know, I don't think we need to look at this list as a final.
No. Yeah.
You know, it certainly diversifies the definition to incorporate things that, as you say, are part of the adequacy aid, base adequacy aid already.
Yeah. See, earlier, about 2 years ago, I believe, when Representative Wolf was on board in the Education Committee, she came forth and changed one of the areas of a substantive criteria for an education and added technologies, engineering and technologies. Engineering is, as I see it, is the problem. Technologies are the solution. But I think we're getting so specific, and you can see it down on the base there, engineering and technologies, which I took out.
Well, actually, it's also, though, if Bruce keeps going down, you'll find it in 3.
Yes, exactly. And there's a whole nother section of statute that deals with elementary and secondary technology in the instruction of. We have a whole statute referencing that. So it's under 188E14, pre-engineering and technology curriculum. And it says, we shall.
Keep going down, Bruce. You'll hit it.
E3.
Yeah, and keep.
Which one are you going towards there, Jay?
But just those curricular standards, which are a part of educational rules,
Yeah.
the content areas, they're still within other parts of the statute.
Right.
It's coming up.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just replicated.
Yeah. Engineering.
So I think if we go back up, I think where we were at in our last conversation is how the policy and purpose statement and the statements in E2 work together to create a broad umbrella, and that 2A is the more, it starts to get a little more granular, and it gets a little more granular as it goes down.
See, there's some really sneaky words.
Can I throw in some context here?
Yeah.
When Claremont 2 came out, the state adopted as you can see from the effective date, the policy and purpose section, and then 193E2, which was very generic, and it repeated the language that the court used back to the court. Then in 2005 and 6, the court heard the Londonderry case on accountability, and I've quoted those. They said your definition is too generic. It's too general, and this was E2. And so the legislature, as you can see, came back with E2A, and because you can see that the effective date of E2A is 2007 originally. And the purpose for enacting that was to respond to the court's invalidation of the first more generic cut. So the purpose for this definition is not to state really the details of adequate education. It's to say, here's the standard against which some family in the future could file a lawsuit and say, state, I'm suing you because you're not giving me this. That's what this standard is supposed to be. That's the purpose. It may not be right, but the timing for how this has happened organically is the first part came first, and it repeated generically the language the court had in Claremont 1 and Claremont 2 back to it. And then the court struck that down, or said it wasn't sufficient in 2006 in the thing I cited, in the case I cited in the thing I sent around. And then the legislature came back and tried to respond to that by getting a little bit more specific. So that's the context for these 3 sections. In fact, the last section, 193E2A, has not yet been reviewed from the perspective of whether it's sufficient to meet the constitutional duty of defining adequacy. There's not been a court case on that.
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, Iris.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with Phil that the whole point of this whole section is to satisfy the court. And I guess in that way, it alarms me, the idea of changing adequate to quality, because that changes the standard for review of what the state's obligation is. And while it might be a wonderful thing to do, I don't think it's wise. And then, as I said, when you told me I was queuing up the discussion, I really didn't realize it because I hadn't seen this before. But I think this takes the list of things that are proposed here, belongs in the costing section, not in the definition. And if you put something like pre-K, which is dear to my heart, spent many years fighting for it, into this in that kind of way as part of the definition, then as Bill said, you're obligated to it. So
I'm glad that that's in a different color. I think it signifies a whole different level of conversation. I agree with you. Go, you keep going, Iris. Sorry.
Nothing. I just find it alarming to have only the reference for curriculum and instruction, which as was pointed out by Rick, it differs from district to district, and no broad statement of what the curriculum of an opportunity for an adequate education is, which was what was tried to be said in 2A. But again, I think we're getting costing and definition mixed up.
Agreed.
Can I add something, Jay, as a point of information? Folks on this call, at least the members of the Adequacy Work Group, also have seen DOE's calculation of what it calls the universal cost of adequacy. And so they do a calculation, Caitlin provided this to us, that it actually, and this is later in our costing discussion, arrives at a per pupil adequacy level, for example, in 2020, of $4,300+. And included in that is our teacher salaries, principal salaries, an administrative assistant salary, a guidance counselor, a library media specialist, a technology coordinator, a custodian, and then they calculate all these per pupil expenditure, and then instructional materials per pupil, technology per pupil, professional development for teachers per teacher, per staff member, maintenance costs per pupil, and transportation costs per pupil, although they exclude transportation. Let's see here.
No, it's part.
No, they do. That's included. That's included. So that's how they arrive at this average when you blend K through 2 and grades 3 through 12 at $4,300. So it's been interesting to me about the basis for including those specific line items in this so-called universal adequacy cost. And Jay or Dave may have more insight on.
No, Bruce, those are cost. That is part of the costing exercise. That's right. Different from the standard. It's completely different.
It is, and it still suggests what it costs on a per pupil basis to provide an adequate education.
But the cost exercise has been structured to do that. So if you can segregate the two, one is if you were a kid and you went to a lawyer and said, I have not been getting an adequate education, my constitutional right fulfilled, my opportunity. And the lawyer says, well, let's see, how can we put on a case? You put on a case that you are failing this standard, the general standard. But the cost issue is something very different. I think it is you're defining the aspects that the state believes are part of the minimum state adequate education. And that requires looking at things like teacher salaries, like they do in other states, like Mass goes through this too.
So, yeah, I just want to jump in here. I don't want to turn our hard job into an impossible job. And I think if we are trying to completely reinvent 193 E2A and a bunch of other chapters, and then also try to come up with a costing and distribution model, and try to come up with a way of raising the revenues to pay for it, then we'll never get there. And part of the reason I think we may never get there if we follow this approach is because if we change the statutes, and I'm not saying changing the definition of adequacy. I agree with what Bill's talking about here. It's the standard is very high level, and you come up with a way of a formula for costing that. But what we have now to work with, since at least for the last 12 years of budgets that were based on the current funding model, is school districts have created budgets based on meeting all of our requirements in the RSAs. Public school is a highly regulated environment, and I think we can discern a couple of things from these budgets that we all know are raised largely using local tax dollars. not state dollars. That taxpayers have a high expectation for performance in New Hampshire public schools. Otherwise, I think statewide we wouldn't be performing at the, at the number 1, 2, 3 levels, which are probably almost indistinguishable. So there's a high expectation for performance. We also know that there's a high differentiation in tax burden depending upon where you live. Yet that expectation for performance, I think, is nearly uniform on that. But with the existing statutes in place, I think our research consultants, and Drew, I think can add to this, can look at what we've been spending and break that down into what statewide we would consider to be the cost of an adequate education, both from a base standpoint and then from a weights to address disparities. But if we're going to change the statutory underpinning of all of these elements that every superintendent and school board have to comply with, then I don't know if we're going to be able to rely on a method that looks at DOE 25s for the last decade.
Yeah, and I don't think so. What I found valuable in Rick's attempt, whether it's quality or adequacy, if it needs an adjective, I don't know that either one it matters. I'm looking past that. I'm looking past some of I'm looking past the PK issue. What I find, because there is, if we just get stuck in this E2A and not look at the rest of 193 of what is public education. Remember, that's what we're defining in this statute. Call it adequacy or anything else. It's public education. And if this is bringing some alignment to what is public education and the costs of public education, I think that actually is a valuable contribution. We have another section of this same 193E in 3B that discusses all of the accountability for the opportunity of an adequate education. And it has all these curricular items described within it. It's a statute that was last tweaked in 2018, first arrived in 2009. I suspect that too is an outgrowth of, that's not just No Child Left Behind language. 2009 is long since it. So I think that there is value, and if I've taken something in your arguments about this should be separate and very conceptual and independent of the costing, I think what you're highlighting for me is that someplace in the statute there ought to be alignment between what is public education and what are the components that make it up. And it is, yes, instruction and curriculum in all of those areas, but it is these other components, whether this language captures them all accurately or not. I think the notion of there are a bunch of circles, Venn diagrams that connect to create what is a whole for public education in this state. And it is captured in a funding formula. Thank goodness it's captured in a funding formula, however low that minimum may be calculated. I'm done.
Jay, I'll go ahead and take the screen off just because I think we're now getting a different level of the conversation.
Could we move maybe to, oh, good.
Want to move to cost?
Well, Iris has her hand up. Now that I've expanded my screen, I can see. And you know, Drew.
Oh, sorry.
Here.
Iris.
Sorry. No, sorry, I didn't put it down after the last time.
I would like to hear from Drew because he's our national expert. He's seen the same exact issue in each state. Let's see if we can't get something from our consultant that's useful.
I'm sure that wasn't intended to exactly.
No, I'm just saying we don't need to recreate the wheel here. We have really good expertise outside the silo of New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear it.
And yes, Drew.
All right. I don't know. Where should I begin? I mean, what would be most helpful for you? I mean, do you want me to kind of, I think at the beginning of the call, Bruce said I might walk through kind of what AIR is doing and how we're thinking about things. Or do you want me to kind of respond to the existing discussion a little bit more directly?
Well, I think that's Bill's question. One thing that I also took from our previous conversation is, and Rick made that link, the language he put into 2A there is very much like what Vermont put into its statute, but which is part of one of your papers. But maybe there's more insight. I think if you can build on this past discussion on the adequacy definition, I think it'd be valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have any strong opinions about the existing definition versus the definition that Rick put together or the definition that Vermont put together. I think the important thing is that it's a little bit vague, right? And I think that you've all been talking about that. You don't want to kind of pin yourself in a corner by being so specific that you have to update the adequacy definition every time you propose a new requirement for school districts, or you say now school districts need a nurse, so now we have to update our whole adequacy definition to include a nurse in our definition. So I think it's good to be a little bit vague and to not necessarily tie the definition too closely to the costing of it. I mean, just so you know, where we're coming at the cost side of it is a lot more conceptual, and we put together one brief that kind of looked at, well, how is New Hampshire performing overall in the country? And New Hampshire is performing very well in the country, as Dave talked about, and as some other presenters, Dr. Kenyon mentioned. There's really no, when we talk about the adequacy of New Hampshire funding from a national perspective, when you look at the national publications, there is no issue with the level of funding in New Hampshire. I think that the questions that you all are having difficulty with is, what is the state's responsibility of that funding versus what is the local responsibility? And good funding formulas have to acknowledge the differences in local capacity to come up with an appropriate overall amount of funding in each school district. And states have gone two different ways with that. Some states have said it's okay for local districts to raise their money, and the state's going to compensate by giving extra to the districts that can't raise their local capacity, as it sounds like that might not be an option in New Hampshire. So other states have gone the other extreme route and said, we're just going to do everything from state funding. But regardless of where the funding comes from, AIR is looking at what is the overall amount of funding that districts need to meet well, I guess this is AIR's now definition of adequacy, and our definition of adequacy that we're planning on using is the state's existing current levels of outcomes. So we don't think that New Hampshire needs to increase outcomes astronomically above where they already are, given that they're already at the top of outcomes in the country nationally, other than maybe Massachusetts and New Jersey have performed well recently. But, you know, you're talking about splitting hairs when you talk about the differences between those states and outcomes. So our approach is saying, look, New Hampshire is performing well already. They're spending a lot of money already. So it's really a distributional issue. If you look at outcomes across the state, there are vast differences in outcomes between districts. I know in some of my recent analysis, Manchester has shown itself to be particularly poorly performing, and the outcomes that we're currently considering to use are test scores, attendance rates, and graduation rates. So we're kind of trying to tie outcomes, assuming that the overall statewide average of outcomes is adequate, but acknowledging that there's differences within the state across districts, and saying the statewide average outcome level is adequate. What is it going to cost to get all school districts up to the statewide average of outcomes, with some districts being far below average, some districts are above average. So how are we going to get all districts to the statewide average? And we're gonna account for differences in student needs. It costs more to get a economically disadvantaged student up to the statewide average. It costs more for a special education student. It costs more for an English learner. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking. How does that fit into the discussion of adequacy? I mean, I think one possible solution, or not, I don't know if it's a solution, you guys are the ones who are going to come up with the solution, but if you say, look, we're already performing well, our statewide definition of adequacy should be about student performance, and are we performing as a state where we expect to be? And I think the answer probably is yes on average, but no when you look at certain school districts. So I don't know if that is helpful for the discussion of adequacy, but I guess I would encourage you to think a little bit more about how performance and student outcomes fit into the definition of adequacy. And I don't know that, like you all have been saying, I don't think that the current definition is problematic. I think it's really a distributional issue more than a definitional issue.
Yeah. So, you know, to put, if we look at two ends of an extreme here, we can either tweak and get more comfortable with the definition. We got another end here that is recognize what the issue is. The issue isn't so much how we define it or even how we cost it. It's how we distribute. And I think by and large, a lot of people would agree with that. It could be a summary statement to arrive at that place.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I think the distributional issue and the cost issue go hand in hand. And the way that we are thinking about the cost issue is by building in the distributional issue into the cost issue, and recognizing that the costs do vary across districts according to the types of students and the context that the districts operate in. And I think one of the potential benefits of taking a more output-oriented approach, outcome-oriented approach that AIR is taking, is that you don't necessarily get into this argument about, is the cost of teacher salaries correct in this spreadsheet? Are we using the correct teacher to student ratios in this spreadsheet? Are we including nurses or not including nurses in this spreadsheet? I think the current approach that New Hampshire has taken has kind of contributed to the ability of the Conval lawsuit to pinpoint and pick apart the existing spreadsheet and say, look, this piece of the spreadsheet is wrong, so we're going to take this to the court. So if you go down the spreadsheet route again, I would expect that someone in the near future is going to look at that spreadsheet and say, no, that spreadsheet's not right. We're going to pick it apart again and go to court. So one of the possible benefits of the outcome-oriented approach that we're taking is that we're not relying on a spreadsheet that's so easy to pick apart. And we're saying more broadly, is New Hampshire achieving the outcomes that it should be to meet the needs of its students? And if it is, great. If not, in certain districts, then how are you gonna, then we're gonna appropriately fund those districts where outcomes are not meeting the standards to get them there.
So I think to get back, we created 3 work groups in this task, and leaving our communications effort as a product of our work as opposed to the outcome of the work. That we could be focusing and reprioritizing. Maybe that's a part of what we are doing on July 27th, is reprioritizing some of those objectives and tasks that we laid out in the first 3 months, and recognizing that there is one giant issue and a number of smaller issues, and let's tackle the giant issue of distribution as the highest priority, and recognize that some of these others are going to get tweaked either by local control or by state mandate, but it really doesn't matter. They need to be satisfied either way. Anyway, I think, David, Mr. Chairman.
Jay, I saw Iris.
Let's be focusing. Yeah, Iris.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting about where Air's going. I'd love to hear more about this outcome-based approach and whether it's been used elsewhere. But what I wanted to say with regard to our task of the definition is, it seems to me if we may go towards an outcome-based approach that's based, one of the 3 factors is test scores. Test scores are based on what's outlined in E2A. And so I think that makes E2A as it stands now, or as we might tweak it, but in concept, what it tries to say in E2A, even more appropriate.
I don't disagree that the minimum standards there are, it's that it focuses so much on the curriculum in E2A. But I'm fine that, Bill.
An outcome, I loved to hear Drew outline the issues. I think he went over each of the issues that we're wrangling with. What was very interesting about the outcomes approach that he's talking about is that the definition of adequacy, which is got a general statement and then some of the curriculum points, could include in it an emphasis on achieving a standard for outcomes. In other words, if our goal is to provide an adequate education everywhere in the state for every child so that they can achieve this outcome. It's not unlike, I'm looking at Barbara, who's a professional educator, it's not unlike mission statements when, school boards spend, you know, weeks working on, here's our mission. We want citizens of the world, for example. This is an outcome-based definition. And the only other thing I'd add is that I know I've said this before, but Governor Lynch essentially adopted that format for his proposal in 2005. It defined an adequacy as a type of target for outcome. It used things like graduation rates. It used things like test scores, which we have a little bit. And what it did is it identified those districts that were above the definition of quality, which he had defined in an index as 1.0, you know, 1.2. He actually was above the average, 1.2. And then the state financial support was targeted to those districts that had deficits, that were at, you know, like Claremont was at 0.87, whereas Hanover was at 1.22. And the goal was to try and bring every district to that standard of 1.2 or 1.1 or something. And the only reason I say that again is I helped write that because he was very committed to changing the dynamic of the kind of, let's stack up the you know, this aid, the average cost is, you know, $23,000 for this level aid with benefits on top of it. That is a prescription for losing a court case, without a doubt, because it's so easy to say, you didn't include this, you didn't include that. I love the concept of output-based, quality-based adequacy, and the definitions we have are pretty good, but they might just need, Jay, a little statement of emphasis that we're focused on achieving these outcomes for every child throughout the state. And then our funding distribution, the worst thing we get is not quality. We're 1, 2, 3. Where it's not total spending, we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe. It is in our distribution. We are regressive. We get an F. That's obviously, to me, our problem. And then we run into the issue of whether the court decisions prohibit the legislature from focusing directly on that problem. That's a question I'm not able to answer, you know, yet.
I really
Oh,
I really like the idea of including some kind of outcome tie into the definition, but I think we need to be careful how we word it and be careful about setting some standard that we can be held accountable to if we're not meeting it. But I think it's an aspirational and a tie-in. It would be really good. I'm not sure we can do it yet. I think we need to see where we go with the whole outcome approach before we know what the right statement to make would be.
Yeah, no, and so what I told, where I left the last conversation is we needed to reground ourselves into what AIR is contributing to this effort. So I'm glad we're making some connections here because that is exactly what they proposed to us, is an outcome-based distribution model that's going to lift those districts and where performance lags. And what would it take to try to bring it back to statewide achieving some outcome standard? So, Barbara, other voices.
I was just going to say that I was very interested in hearing, Drew, your explanation of working more with the outcomes. I do feel, and thank you, Bill, I do feel that that might be something we need to look at. But I also agree with Iris, we have to be very careful how we define that, where we place it, how we tie it. I'm excited to hear AIR going in that, looking at that direction. There are a couple of other states that are doing such a thing, and I'll be interested to hear what we might get yet from AIR. So thank you, Drew, because for putting that forward a little bit today was very helpful.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that the state necessarily needs to be the ones who define the outcome, or the legislature needs to be the ones who define the outcomes. all states already have outcome targets as their accountability measures. You already have the smarter balanced assessment, or you might have actually gone away from it in the last year or two, I forget, but you already have accountability standards that define where schools should be on both assessment scores and graduation rates. And those are set by the department, or the Department of Education, maybe the State Board of Education, but I mean, they're already there. And I don't know that you need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, I think we all have a homework assignment in looking at 193, because you can't isolate one section of it. And I think that may be another overall statement is let's answer some of the questions that we've raised in these conversations, because we have accountability standards that are based on inputs. We have accountability standards that are based on performance. And so the sections are here. And you know, it's great to wrestle with what isn't optimal in these, but it's also good to come back and say, but we already have the basics enough to go forward and focus on the basic question that we've got in front of us. It's a distribution question to try to achieve the outcomes of across the state and equalize those opportunities. Dick.
Yeah, I just felt I should chime in on this distribution point. It's more than that, and I think Drew said that. It's the costing and distribution. You've got to start somewhere and figure out where you go, up or down, with our multitude of districts. And in looking at outcomes, Drew and his group, as I listened to him, are going to be looking at outcomes in the New Hampshire context, which is a spending context, among other things, with wide distribution across communities. So, at the heart of this adequacy work group that I'm on the edges of is the determination of the cost of adequacy. That has a distributional aspect to it, but it also has a core to it. So I just wanted to make that point, and I guess I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Any other, so focus on, I mean, this part of the conversation is trying to get at determining cost. I see Rick's hand up, but Drew, I want to engage you again someplace in this conversation to focus us on what information are we lacking relative to cost?
I mean,
are we lacking any information relative to cost?
No, I mean, I think we're working from the assumption that the overall levels of spending in New Hampshire are contributing to the outcomes that are being observed in New Hampshire. So when we talk about tying outcomes to costs, we're talking about the overall levels of spending that are happening in New Hampshire, and then we kind of can peel back different components of that and say, well, the state's obviously not responsible for federal spending, so let's take that off the top. The state's not responsible, or maybe we want to also peel back. We had some discussion in our smaller group meeting about catastrophic aid the last few days. So maybe we want to peel back the special education catastrophic aid off of that. And then it's really a question of, once you define what cost target you're shooting at with whatever pots of money subtracted off the top that you want to take off, then it's really a question of how are we going to hit that cost with the revenues that are available. And I think that's going to be another big challenge. But the first step is the setting the cost target and the distribution of costs across all districts. And then the second step is how are you going to pay for that? And when we're thinking about the distribution of costs, we're talking about the all-inclusive costs minus a few of these smaller pieces off the top.
Yes, and the criteria for that, if we've got $3.2 billion being spent, and you've just suggested, well, maybe there are some unique spendings that might come, expenditures that might come off of that total. What's the criteria for determining that you pull something out? What do you do?
Well, and for federal spending, we're assuming that that's not going to be the state's responsibility for distributing. That's going to be distributed through some formula outside of the state's control, direct control. And so when we think about the overall cost, we're assuming that's going to be added back through the federal distribution mechanisms. When we talk about catastrophic aid being taken off, then that's something that might be out of the district's control and might vary widely from district to district, not related to any specific other need factor. So we might want to account for that through a separate mechanism. You might want to, I mean, transportation might be another one that you might think could be pulled off the top and distributed separately, because transportation conceptually might not relate to student outcomes and might be related to other district contextual factors that we're not, I mean, we're considering district size and possibly population density, which you would think would be related to transportation costs, but you might think that transportation costs might be better allocated through a separate mechanism. But I think in general, any of the costs that you think are going to contribute to the student outcomes that we're observing and are related to the types of students that we're accounting for in our formula, then I think those should just fall within the main funding formula.
I have a question.
Yeah. I recognize that.
Thank you. Yes. I love it. So the higher achieving or highest outcome districts under this kind of concept, would they get any aid?
Well, we're setting a cost target that's inclusive of state and local revenue. So the costs of the highest achieving districts might be $11,000 or $12,000 per student. And how we end up funding that is a separate question from what it costs. So then I think then the separate question is, where is that money going to come from? And it sounds like from the presentation that you had on Monday that all the funding is probably supposed to come from the state. But I mean, I guess that's up for debate. AIR will model some different ways to fund it. One option might be all from the state. Another option might be setting some constant local contribution that's the same across the state. And maybe that would be constitutional under the idea that all districts are going to have the same minimum local contribution. I don't know. I think that would be a question for constitutional scholars. But yeah, I think the cost target should be a separate question from how it's going to be paid for.
Yeah, I see Dick's hand up, and we're going to come up to 5 o'clock pretty quick. So if there are other views that haven't been expressed yet, please.
Okay, I'll be real quick.
Yeah.
I think that we do need to have that separate conversation. Some of us have been having it regarding the extent to which the state must fund the determined cost, whatever it turns out to be, and how that distribution of funding would come out. I think it's a discussion that we're going to dig deeply into, and there is the constitutional, the language from the court opinions that we've heard about, and we need to work through that language in the context we're living in now, and maybe we'll come to a different place, but keep an open mind on that is what I'm saying, and we'll work through it. I think the cost is the first thing, and then who pays for it is the second thing.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Jay, you and I have talked about this. I think as both adequacy, as you start to put together the costing and distribution, we really need to get together with fiscal policy side and really see how these two plans start to weave. I'm weaving my hands together. To make that work. And I guess what I would ask Drew is, if you're going to be looking at modeling a local contribution as being outside of a state tax or outside of state dollars, but a local education property tax on this, I wonder to what extent that contribution could factor in equalized value per pupil or equalized value per weighted pupil, so that if in fact the distribution plan means that every district's going to come up $5,000 short, let's say, that it's still going to cost Berlin 10 times the effort than it costs Newcastle to make up for that difference.
Well, I think the idea is that if you say the minimum local effort is, I don't know,
a rate.
Five mils, and the low capacity districts might raise 1/10 of their revenue at that rate. The high capacity districts might raise 99% or even above 100% at that rate, and then the state fills in the difference. And
right, I guess what I'm saying is, if the state requires a local tax rate or for the local tax burden, then that's the same as a statewide education property tax. Or
right.
Certainly very similar to, I mean, it looks like exactly like what's being done right now. But if it's going to be if it's going to be some other way, then I think it needs to, it just needs to be fair. It needs to be equitable there too.
That's a good goal.
Fair is good.
Yeah.
Rick?
Thank you. I'm still seeing a real disconnect between what we say in statute in 193E, where we're saying that an adequate education shall be defined or identified as the school approval standards. Then I'm looking at the school approval standards here, and we all have a copy of it. It's Ed 306, and it mentions school facilities. It mentions career and technical education, which we don't fund in our adequacy formula. But there's no mention of transportation. So I'm just wondering, as we tweak our statutes and modify our statutes, there doesn't seem to be any parallel or alignment with how we cost and distribute. In other words, we add things to our statutes and build standards, but we never then fund it on the other side of the coin. And I would say that from my reading just now, transportation doesn't belong in the adequacy formula at all. There's no reference to it in the school approval standards, which we say that's the definition of the opportunity for an adequate education. And these are done by this Department of Education and the State Board of Education. and come back to GELCAR for approval. So I'd like to make sure that our school approval standards are aligned with our costing formula, and how we fund and how we distribute dollars out. They're not aligned, and they haven't been modified. That formula has remained pretty much the same, except, and it's been chipped away at, and part of it had been destroyed. There's no reference to special education either in the school approval standards, none. So there's some disconnects. We are not aligned between statute and rule and practice. We need to get aligned. We talked about alignment earlier in our discussion here today. This needs to be done.
All right, Bill, 2 minutes. No,
Last point, we have to report to, our group has to report on July 27th. We've covered a lot of ground. The one principle that I saw nodding heads on, it's a generic principle. It needs a lot more work. It needs details, but that having a distribution that is more progressive, more fair, that focuses on need, subject to all the constraints, that's had nodding heads. It's hard not to, but you know, subject to all of the complications. I'm just wondering, Jay, what are you going to report that we've had any movement towards a central principle, not details, but a central governing principle?
Yeah, and I think it's that you know, when you don't have consensus around the middle, you define the ends, and I think that's, you know, essentially what we have, and one end is fairly straightforward in accepting what we have as it is, with maybe some tweaks, and we can manage some of that, whether within this process or outside of it. I think the key is the focus on the couple of things, and I agree with you. The differentiation of in the distribution is, and Drew just focused our attention on if the state has an average cost, however it defines how it's going to fund that average cost, including local contribution, that it's the weight below that average that needs to be equalized, right? To try to bring that average in both outcomes and distribution up to some equilibrium. I think that refocuses the you know, we have a core problem, and I think we can easily be distracted by some of these other definitional things that may not be as important to us as the core problem. So I think David, for me, I think there is an overall refocusing from the July 27th. That I think that's a great, I think that's what we were aiming for anyway. And I don't think it comes in 3 different work group components. I think it comes with an overall thought of what it is we need to accomplish, most fundamental to the outcome of the committee.
Yeah, I think you've gotten to a good place today. This is a great discussion today, and I'm really glad Drew was able to join us. I think it's really helpful, and you know, let's think about some of the things we talked about or that were brought up today too, with regards to outcomes. You know, I'm not trying to create something that's an impossible standard for the state to live up to, but if there's a line that needs to be changed or something that needs to be addressed that helps pin our funding and distribution to equitable access to comparable educational outcomes, and I think there's already court decisions that talk about tax equity, then I think that's something to consider.
All right.
And Jay and Dave, I made a note to myself to be in touch with the three of you and Mel about what kind of reporting out each work group will do on Monday, sort of the high level key findings, questions, and next steps. So where have we landed so far? And there's some degree of landing today, some broad conceptual. We still have a set of questions, and so articulating those, and then what the next steps are. So I'll send a note to the three of you and to Carrie and Jordan and Michelle. And so that'll be our homework between now and Monday afternoon is creating, even in bullet list form, what those are for the full commission to respond to. And this idea of resetting our own internal charge to ourselves, as we've grappled with definitional questions and now distribution questions, does seem to me to be exactly where we need to, what the reset task is for Monday. And we only could get to that point by having traveled this kind of long and windy road prior to today and prior to Monday.
Thanks for that summary.
But it does affect, for example, with engagement, we're moving into the next phase of getting public input. And so we want to be sure that maybe the public emphasis in public input is not definitional, but it's equity and distributional and revenue sources to achieve some kind of distribution.
Easy, Mel.
Mm-hmm. It's a complicated process. I mean,
right.
Looking back on looking back personally on where I was in January, very different than how I feel today. I've learned so much about the subject, and I continue to do so every time we get together. And I think the public engagement process is really an essential thing, because I think that's also an iterative process where we learn from the public, but also hopefully, the public and the stakeholders are following what we're doing as well. So it's this can't be quick, if we want to reach a successful outcome. And I think we have to reach a successful outcome.
And I do want to thank Rick for, rather than watching television last night, getting into the statute, giving us some red lines. It was an excellent provocation prompt for us to respond to, and helped us move this conversation forward. Absolutely. I also.
All right. Red Sox were down 2-0. Vlad Jr. hit a home run, 2 runs, and then they were rained out at the 5th inning. So you didn't miss anything.
And I also want to note that Drew came off his vacation time to join us for these couple of hours. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Drew.
And Rick, I'll second that. I'm glad you struggled with this and caused us to work it through. It was very helpful, very helpful. All right, after 5.
All right.
I'll see you Monday.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Matt, send me those notes when you get a chance.